Hey everyone, it's me, Amy Walter. The podcast is brought to you by the Cook Political Report. So if you love these conversations, you should consider becoming a subscriber to the Cook Political Report. We have so much coming up in the weeks and months ahead, like a conversation I'll be hosting on what we learned about 2024 swing state voters. It's on December 5th and it's only available to subscribers. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. Hello, this is The Odd Years. I'm Amy Walter. I'm a big believer that politicians, just like the rest of us, are driven by incentives. If voters reward or punish a certain behavior, well, politicians and candidates will follow suit. For example, everyone says they hate how vitriolic and polarized our politics has become, and yet our current political system helps to promote this very behavior. Which is why I've been really interested in electoral reforms that incentivize candidates to appeal to voters across the political spectrum, instead of just focusing on the most ideological and extreme voices in their party. Reforms like a primary system that all candidates, regardless of party, run on the same ballot, with the top two or more advancing to the general election. Another reform is ranked choice voting, which asks voters to rank their pick of candidates in order of preference. Now, the thinking behind these ideas is that the American public is less divided than the elected officials we send to Congress. And that makes it harder to pass legislation that many people actually support. So, if there's a way to run our elections so that candidates didn't have to appeal to the more extreme elements of their parties, shouldn't we move towards that kind of system? That all sounds like something voters would like to see, right? Well, reformers thought so too. And in 2024, they helped get ranked choice voting on the ballot in a bunch of states like Colorado, Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho, as well as Washington, D.C. But while Americans are quite unhappy with how politics and governing worked these days, these reforms ultimately were rejected in almost all the places where they appeared on the ballot. And I wanted to know why. So I asked Nick Triano to join me on the podcast. Nick has long been a part of the electoral reform movement. He's the executive director of Unite America, a nonpartisan election reform organization. He's also the author of Primary Solution: Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. Here's our conversation. Hey, Nick, thank you so much for joining me. Great to see you.
Great to be with you, Amy.
All right, well, let's step back for a second before we get into the results of this election and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with Unite America. I was reading through your book, The Primary Solution, and you make this point that abolishing partisan primaries is the single most important thing we can do to improve representation in our government and hold it accountable to delivering better results. So what does that mean?
Well, Amy, as we saw in this last election, voters are angry and they're alienated. They're not seeing government be able to address the issues that they really care about and that are going to shape our future. And the point that I try to make in the book is that our dissatisfaction with governance, in my view, is less about who we elect and more about how we elect them, because our election process and system is really what determines who runs, who wins, but most importantly, the incentives that our leaders have once in office, whether they're trying to govern in the public interest to solve problems or whether they're just pandering to the base of their party to get reelected. And unfortunately, right now, what it takes to get reelected runs completely contrary to what it actually takes to govern. And I think that's fundamentally the challenge that we have in our politics, and is why myself and my organization at Unite America is so focused on addressing this at a systemic level through nonpartisan election reform.
And before we get into the solution for nonpartisan election reform, just walk me through your thinking here about elections and pandering and to the base. And we do know that we have fewer competitive districts than we've had, certainly in my time covering politics. We know that we have now just probably 20 split district congressional districts out of 435. We only have three states that have a Democrat and a Republican senator instead of two members from the same party. So it's pretty clear that our politics have become more calcified. But it's sort of a chicken and an egg thing, right, Nick? Because on the one hand, you say, are these folks just pandering to the base, or do we live in basically two Americas where blue state people want one thing and red state people want another? And so it's not so much that they're not compromising or finding a middle, it's that they literally do not agree on a common set of problems.
Well, to your point, and I write about this as well, I don't believe we live in a two-party system. We live in two one-party systems in most parts of the country. And that lack of competition between the political parties means that the party bosses are the party bases because they get to decide most elections. I'll break that down just into a couple component parts. Like you said, most districts are safe for one party or another nowadays.
Yeah.
About 87% of congressional districts, which means that in the November election is really over before it even begins. It's the party primary when the majority party determines its nominee that effectively decides the election. And in that primary, not only do you have fewer people turning out, in a lot of states, the rules prohibit a lot of voters from participating in the majority party's primary, including independent voters in 15 states. And so when we did the math on this, we found that only 7% of eligible voters cast ballots in primaries that dictated the outcome in 87% of districts this year. So you have 7% of the country electing 87% of our leaders. It's no wonder why, even when the American people can find agreement and common ground on some issues, our Congress doesn't, because they don't represent a majority of us. And that's really what we're trying to change.
And so one of your ideas, or it seems there are two ideas here that you all put forward, and then we saw ballot initiatives in many states on these, are one, as you said, opening up the primary process so that you don't have to be registered with a Democrat or Republican Party in order to participate. But really what we saw on the ballots this year in, I think, 10 states was a question about the way in which voters choose candidates, both in the primary and the general election, through a top four system or ranked choice voting. So can you walk us through, one, what those things are, and two, why you think that they are going to produce a more representative member of Congress?
Well, I'll start with the sort of two principles that we advocate. One is that every eligible voter should be able to vote for whomever they want, regardless of party, in every taxpayer-funded election. And the second principle is that whoever wins should be able to be required to earn a true majority of support, as opposed to just a plurality. And those two principles are supported by over 3/4 of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. In fact, they're so common sense to people that our own polling found that 8 out of 10 voters think that's the way that the current system works. Unfortunately, it's not. And so the reforms that we're putting forward aim to uphold those principles by getting rid of the traditional bifurcated party primary system. So instead of having a Democratic primary or Republican primary, there's a single all-candidate primary. And every voter gets to vote for whomever they want for every office. And the top finishers then advance to the general election, where whoever gets a majority of votes wins. A few of these systems that were on the ballot this year, as you said, advance not just the top two to the general election, but the top four. And when you have multiple candidates in the general election, you can ensure a majority winner kind of one of two ways. You can either have a runoff election among the top two if no one gets a majority, or you can have an instant runoff. And an instant runoff is just when you are able to rank your candidates according to preference, so your backup choices are already known. And the benefit of this system to voters is you have a lot more power, because the general election is now the election of consequence, not just the primary, and you get to choose whoever you want. And the benefit for our democracy and our politics is that as a candidate and elected official, from day one, you're incentivized to be responsive to a true majority of the electorate, not just the 7% that otherwise would control your fate, in a low turnout party primary. These two changes, I think, is how we can get our politics, back on track in terms of having a system of government that really is about we the people.
Right. And so the theory being the kinds of people who win a ranked choice vote election are those who don't alienate um, more people than they attract, right? That you have to build a coalition in order to hit the 50% needed to win. And you can't do that if you're only pandering to one side or the other.
Exactly.
Or one fraction
Yep.
of the electorate. Yeah.
You need to win a majority. And then importantly, when you're in office and working to negotiate legislation and vote on legislation, the gating question is no longer what can I do up until the point where I might be primaried from within my own party. That fear of being primaried is what haunts most elected officials because that's the only election truly that many of them have any competition in or potential competition in. Under this system, it eliminates essentially the threat of being primaried, and that means, okay, you can be a Republican and work with Democrats, for example, on immigration reform that may provide a pathway to legal status for Dreamers, or you can be a Democrat and work with Republicans on immigration reform and advocate for more border security. I mean, you can take on the sort of sacred cows within your own party to advance issues that a true majority of your constituents want. That's what representative government is really supposed to be about. And it's been distorted by this system of party primaries that were invented a century ago. They worked kind of well for about that time until both parties became highly polarized. And today, they're much more part of the problem than the solution.
In 10 of these states, voters did have the opportunity to do just as you're saying, Nick, is to say, let's break up this system. Let's ensure that we get representative government that is truly representative and pass these ballot initiatives that allow for these top four and ranked choice voting systems. But in every one of those states, with the exception, I think, of the District of Columbia, they failed to pass. Alaska looks like the attempt to repeal it has failed. So that is a success, but it is not a new success. But in places where for the first time, giving voters a chance to say, let's shake up this system, they chose to stick with the current system. What do you think that says?
Well, let me put this in a little perspective by saying Alaska was the first state to adopt a top four election system in 2020. Alaska used it for the first time in 2022, and it did what the reform promises to do. There was a 60% increase in the number of voters who cast ballots in truly competitive elections where their vote mattered, and it resulted in the election of a pretty diverse slate of statewide candidates, a conservative Republican governor, a moderate Republican senator, and Lisa Murkowski, who would have likely otherwise lost her party primary, and a moderate Democrat for U.S. House. And so that proof of concept essentially inspired reformers in other states to pursue similar reforms on the ballot this year. Not all were top four plus ranked choice voting. Some states didn't prescribe the type of primary reform exactly. Some states, went with a top two model, which is, used in states like Washington and California. And we saw the most ballot initiatives since the progressive era when the ballot initiative process itself was created over a century ago. 6 states aimed at abolishing party primaries. And in those states, several million people signed petitions to get on the ballot. Ultimately, millions of people voted for these initiatives. I think fundamentally 2024 really can't be seen as anything but a giant leap forward for the movement of people that have been working on trying to reform our primaries for a very long time. The state that used it, which is Alaska, decided to keep it. And I think that suggests that voters like it once they start using it. Even for folks that voted against it, keeping the system, they still report in our exit polling that 8 out of 10 of them find the new system simple to use, which sort of flies in the face of some of the opposition and critics that say it's too complex, or confusing. And then in a handful of other states, Montana, 49%, Nevada, 47%, Colorado, 46%, came quite close. And it was in the face of pretty ferocious opposition from the party political establishment to try and stop this from happening, it really says something that the only thing that both parties agreed on this election was to try and stop these reforms in their tracks. In fact, the Republican Party in Montana reallocated some funding from fighting Tester to putting against this reform. And in Nevada, the Democrats reallocated some funding from supporting their candidates to fighting this reform because they're terrified at what it might mean to lose control over this process to the voters. They don't want to give up their own power. That's something not new in the course of our country's history, but they're dug in. And I think our movement has shown that we're willing to fight them and that we're coming quite close to getting to the point of getting these initiatives over the finish line. We're disappointed, of course, in the results, but not deterred in continuing to pursue that mission.
Let's look at Alaska for just an example here. I mean, you're right that it produced a very diverse slate of elected officials from very conservative to more moderate Democrat. And yet voters, if they're happy with it, they didn't seem to express that. If it wins, and it looks like it's very, very close to winning, it will be by the skin of its teeth. So if it's working so well, why didn't more voters come out to positively embrace it by saying, yeah, let's keep it?
Well, I do think one of the dynamics that we saw when it was first used in 2022, and this was the congressional seat that Sarah Palin was running for and ran a pretty divisive campaign against the other Republican in that race, a guy named Nick Begich, was that the moderate Dem Mary Peltola's success came as a result of Republican infighting and Republicans who rather ranked Mary second than the other Republican. And so they lost fair and square under the system. However, it did produce a backlash among Republican voters in that state who rather blamed the reform rather than the party or the candidates for the type of campaigns they ran under it. And so I do think that some of the opposition to this system is a result. We're living in partisan and polarized times. And if you don't like the result of the election, a lot of folks now are blaming the election system. And I think we will begin to see that change because what happened this year, Nick Begich ran again, and this time he had the most first place votes, but not over 50%. And under ranked choice voting, he was put over the 50% threshold and won election. Mary Peltola lost. And so now the same system produced a Republican because guess what? That's what a majority of Alaskans who voted under this system desired this time around. I do believe that will begin to turn down the temperature around this reform in Alaska, showing that it doesn't tilt the scales to one party or another. It simply does empower the majority will.
Let's talk, maybe we can move next to a place like Nevada. Nevada has a rule that a ballot initiative needs to pass in 2 consecutive elections in order to be implemented. And ranked choice voting passed in 2022, 53-47, and then 2 years later, it loses by a similar margin, 47-53. Talk to us about why you think that happened. Is this just a change in the electorate? Obviously, more people show up and vote in a presidential than a midterm. Or is it that the opponents of this reform were more organized, spent more money, and were basically more effective at being able to undermine the claims of reform?
I think it's a bit of both. In 2022, the Democratic Party machine in Nevada spent over $1 million to try and keep it off the ballot. Litigation, even hiring people to intimidate petition gatherers, signature gatherers. But then when it got on the ballot, there was no robust opposition in the general election, probably because they thought, well, let's just wait to see if it passes and then we'll fight them on the round 2. And sure enough, this year, the same party apparatus put over $12 million of advertising on television trying to convince voters that there would be a 10-fold increase in the number of spoiled ballots if the system were adopted by totally manipulating a research study that, and I'll make a directional point here, instead of 99.9% of ballots being cast accurately, it might be 99.8. And so that tenth of a decimal is 10 times, greater if you just look at that slice, but totally mischaracterizing the research on it. And I think planted doubts in voters' minds. And so when voters vote no on a ballot initiative, as you know, they're not always rendering a final decision with conviction. They may just default to no because the yes campaign hasn't proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden really does exist with yes. And so all the opponents have to do is plant some doubt. And that's what the party apparatus successfully did. And that's why the status quo prevails. And what does that status quo mean in Nevada? It means that close to 1 million registered voters, U.S. citizens and taxpayers, will not be able to vote in the next primary election there because of the state's closed primary. That's the system that the Democratic Party fought to uphold. That's the system that I think is untenable as more and more voters do leave both political parties, as young voters grow their share of the electorate. So they may have won on round two, but it's not the last round, I have a feeling, on this particular issue.
Nick, it's so funny because we talk about the party apparatus, and you're right, whether it's a Democrat and Republican, this is one thing they agree on, the idea that ranked choice voting or this top four system really undercuts their power. And at the same time, I feel like so many of these primaries in and of themselves are no longer as controllable, so to speak, by the parties. In other words, if you ask party operatives or just the strategists, who would you like to see as the nominee? Oftentimes, those candidates don't make it through the primary, despite getting the backing of the party. And so, again, this is not the system you write about, the Tammany Hall and the sort of party boss system of the old days. We don't really even have that now. So what is it ultimately that the parties are afraid of? That it just simply feels like then they have really no influence at all? Or is it that they now have to readjust the way that they think about campaigning?
I think it's frankly fear of change. If you have political power right now, even if it's very tenuous in a closely divided state, you want to cling to it. And that's what they're doing, despite the fact that, to your point, I don't think it's in their medium to long-term interest to do so. Both parties are a declining market share of the electorate right now. It should be to their advantage to want to reach a wider base of potential voters. But they only think one election cycle at a time. And that's why I think they're opposing this. And the reason why they're opposing it, I think, is less to do with the fact that the actual party leaders have a lot of influence in candidate selection. They've lost that to the activists in their own party. What they are trying to keep, however, is the dynamic that the other party might nominate someone so far outside the mainstream that they have an advantage in the general election. Democrats in Nevada, for example, and we saw this over the last two election cycles, will spend money to try and elect or nominate, the most extreme Republican to fight in the general election because it may get them some advantage. And so they manipulate the current system for short-term gain. And I think that's, again, short-sighted because not only is it not great for the parties, it's terrible for our democracy. It's perpetuating this zero-sum partisan warfare that, yes, you can win the next election, but what are you going to get done in Congress as the system becomes so much more divided and dysfunctional? And when you're playing with fire of electing the most extreme members of the left and the right. So it's not sustainable, and things that aren't sustainable do tend to stop at some point.
A quick break. We'll be back with Nick Troiano. It's the holiday season. Do you have someone in your life who's already thinking about the midterms? Someone who wants to gather all the information they can on past and future elections? Well, we have the perfect solution for you, the Cook Political Report gift card. Gift cards are available in amounts of $100 or $350. Go to cookpolitical.com/gift-card. The other disconnect, I think, Nick, for this cycle, and we talked about this a little bit, but I'd like to dig a little bit more into it, is this real frustration among voters, this desire to upset the apple cart, to break the status quo, to go after the system, break down the system or the institutions. And it sure seems to me like what you were offering is a way to do that. Why are voters not connecting your issue with the kind of things that they're saying that they want, which is a change to the system and shaking up and shaking out the status quo?
Well, in many ways, that's why I think our reform campaigns were a bit of a victim of the problem that we're trying to solve, which is one of hyperpartisanship and polarization. And what I mean by that is when you ask voters, do they support the idea of an all-candidate primary where they get to vote for anyone they want and that leaders have to earn majority support, 60 or 70% will say yes, including majorities across Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. But they don't hold that view with a lot of conviction right now. And so they'll keep saying that maybe up until Labor Day. And then when the parties start to ramp up their opposition machine and plant doubts like, actually, this new system is intended to rig elections to support the other party, and they weaponize the partisanship, the negative partisanship in the system, well, then a lot of voters begin to, go back to their camp and will vote against these reforms. And it's not the voters' fault. They're hearing from messengers they trust on their own side, false information and fear-mongering. And so they will say, okay, it seems too risky, not right now, and vote no. That means we have a lot of more work to do in our movement to educate and engage voters earlier on than before these campaigns as to what problem we're trying to solve, how these reforms will solve the problem, and ultimately impact the issues that they care about. So if you're upset about the state of our economy and a broken immigration system and a rising budget deficit, or maybe the latter part is just me these days, these reforms are critical to actually addressing those problems. And short of it, we're going to be continuing in this sort of pendulum politics where we're switching parties every 2 years, but not really making much progress.
Yeah, not much is changing.
Right.
Yeah, ultimately. So talk about the kind of money that was spent in some of these races, your side versus the opposition. Were you greatly outspent? Was this different from state to state? What did this look like?
At the 30,000 foot level, as you know, we just came out of an election cycle in which both parties spent, $16 billion trying to keep and maintain their own political power. The movement that is trying to actually fix the system in total, probably over around $150 million invested across all 9 different states with various reforms on the ballot. And we had the resource advantage, but that's required actually to do the kind of education and persuasion that we need to get voters to yes. The no side spent tens of millions of dollars to be sure, and has the upper hand in just needing to be able to place some doubt. So they had enough resources to successfully do that. But I do think that more important than resources is the investment of time. This is not an issue that will win on a single election day. This is a decade-long fight. And like any movement, it will build a stronger foundation after each of these campaigns because we now leave the cycle with a stronger asset of more awareness, more support, stronger infrastructure than ever before.
Nick, there's not a lot of examples we can point to of how ranked choice voting has made an impact in terms of doing the kinds of things you say that it would do, by helping to elect folks who are more willing to be bipartisan or willing to buck, say, their party on certain votes. But we have had a top 2 system in some of these states like California and Washington for how long? How many years? 20 years, maybe more?
In California, about 15 years now, a little under 15 years.
So is there any evidence in a state like California that even opening up the primary, which is what you're making the case, whether it's ranked choice or just letting everybody vote on one ballot, so the top 2 candidates, regardless of party, go on to the general election, Is there any evidence that this has actually moderated the kinds of people who are coming to Congress or coming to the legislature in that state?
The short answer is yes. And the goal is less about sort of this elusive idea of moderation and more about this idea around improving representation. A blue state or a blue district, even under this reform, is going to elect a more progressive candidate. In Louisiana, where they got rid of primaries 50 years ago, they're going to elect a more conservative, representative from their state or districts there. However, what is true in Louisiana and true in California is it'll be a candidate who represents a true majority of their constituents and can govern without the fear of being primaried if they work collaboratively on an issue. And in both states, they have benefited from better governance as a result of that. There was one study out of USC by Professor Christian Gross who found that members elected under these nonpartisan primary systems are about 18 percentage points less ideologically extreme relative to new members elected from closed primary states. And they measure that based on roll call voting in Congress. So that's one data point for it. But the best anecdote I can give is that right now in this new session of Congress coming up in January, the only members that are still there who voted to impeach or convict Donald Trump after January 6th came from states that abolished party primaries. And no matter how you feel about that issue, it's a good issue to represent what it means to buck your party, like in a pretty serious way. And the fact that these members still survived and the rest did not suggests to me there's a pretty big difference, right, between having an open system or closed one.
That's right. And yet it also leads us right back to where we started in this conversation. For partisans, they hear that and they say, oh, well, there's no price to pay for a member of my party basically abandoning us, right? So I don't know that I like this idea that, whether if I'm a Republican, I say, oh, well, really, all it's doing is insulating anti-Trump or sort of people who are against the vision of the majority of the party from defeat. If I look at, again, the examples in Maine or in Alaska, the most successful people in those states have all been folks who don't necessarily fit the current Republican mold. Susan Collins, Elisa Murkowski, both of whom have not exactly been best friends of Donald Trump's. So how do you convince somebody who's a conservative Republican or a strong supporter of Donald Trump that this system actually, it's not going to hurt you guys. It's not benefiting only certain types of Republicans or certain kinds of Democrats.
Again, I would point to Louisiana as a good example of the type of system that we advocate for. And you don't get a lot of anti-Trump Republicans coming out of that congressional delegation. You do get a principled conservative like a Bill Cassidy, but you also get more Trump-aligned conservative like a Senator Kennedy there too. The system doesn't dictate the type of candidate that gets elected. The people still do. It's just a majority of the people will still get to do that under this current system. The question also reminds me of what I write about in the book in terms of the importance of disentangling, which should be a separate system that parties should use to recruit and endorse and support their candidates, from what our publicly funded and government-run election system should do, which is to try and discern voter preferences in the best way possible to elect the most representative candidate. Right now, the two parties want to be the only teams in the league and setting the rules of the game. But we should have more of a separation, really, between the role of political parties in our democracy and the role that our election system and the 1% of Americans who are not affiliated with either party should have a voice in that system. And that's really what these reforms are intended to get at, is to not injure the political parties, but put them in their proper role, in our democracy, which I think will be to the benefit of the whole country.
So, can we talk about what the plan is for moving forward? Are you going to continue doing the state by state ballot initiative effort? or are you going to take a new path?
We're deeply committed to solving what we still view as the biggest solvable problem in our democracy today with party primaries. And as someone who not only comes at this from an academic viewpoint, but an activist one in terms of how do you actually change policy and focused on winning, I do take some inspiration from what movements like marriage equality have been able to do in our own lifetimes in the last 25 years. 2003 was the first major success out of a court in Massachusetts. They fought like hell to protect it. That's basically our Alaska. In 2004, 11 states voted to ban same-sex marriage on the ballot. They didn't go home, right? In 2005, they wrote a plan of how they were going to achieve state-by-state success on this issue and change public opinion in the process. Within a decade, not only did more states adopt not just the North Star, but incremental steps toward it, whether that was civil unions or non-discrimination. And within a decade, it's law of the land. 5 years later, the Congress passes a bipartisan bill. I use it just as an example of saying this is how change is made in the country. It doesn't happen overnight. Movements take time, and oftentimes it's step-by-step sustained progress that leads to big change. And so 2024 for election reform was not a setback. It was definitely a step forward. We protected our most important campaign, got 8 million people to cast an affirmative ballot for reform, had an important victory for allowing independents to vote and ranked choice voting in the nation's capital. And I think that's the momentum that will continue to propel us forward. Most immediately in legislative sessions beginning in January, we're going to be active in close to a dozen states, both to protect against moves to close the primaries and at least to give independents the right to vote. I mean, there are 15 states right now where over 15 million Americans can't vote in the primary, states like Pennsylvania and New Mexico. So we're going to be pushing forward important legislation and gearing up for the next ballot campaigns in the cycles to come.
So, no specific plan right at this moment for 2026, but what you're saying is you expect to see that other states are going to either put ballot initiatives forward or are going to try to move it through the legislative process in states that don't have a ballot initiative process.
Yeah, a multi-pronged strategy depending on the state, depending on the policy. And we will also see a lot of organic bottom-up activity from reformers and leaders in individual states. Within the last week after this election, leaders in Oklahoma who've been working on this issue for years now filed a top two ballot initiative in a state. It's one of the states, like 25 other states, where there was zero competitive general elections for Congress in this past cycle. And in the last cycle, what we saw in Oklahoma, too, was every district not only determined by the primary, but there's only one candidate on the ballot in the primary. You can't even say there's an election happening if there's no choice or competition. So states like Oklahoma and others, I think, are going to continue to move forward, potentially as soon as 2026.
And finally, maybe a more existential question, and this is really about getting voters to show up in primaries in the first place. When I was looking at this, it was probably 10 years ago, looking at this difference between open and closed primaries, I noticed that in states that do have open primaries, so you don't have to be registered with a party, you can show up, pull the ballot and vote. Again, you might not have all the candidates on one ballot, but you can pick a R ballot or you can pick a D ballot. Versus the states where you have to be registered to show up and can only vote for that party. I didn't see that the states that had open primaries had more participation than those who had closed primaries. In other words, it seems that the problem is that getting people to believe that primaries matter or that their vote is consequential when it's not November is one of the harder things to do in politics. And I'm wondering how you approach that question.
That's a very good question, and I think is the reason why we're not focused on just trying to get people to vote in the current system, why we need to change the current system in order to make the general election the election that truly decides the outcome. Because even under the system that we're proposing, the impact of it is less about who gets to vote and how many people vote in the primary, although it's great that more people have the opportunity. The impact is that in a blue district, you might have more than one blue candidate to choose from in November, in a red district, vice versa, so that those candidates truly do have to appeal to most voters when most voters actually go to the polls. And I think that's the kind of most impactful aspect of changing the system.
That's a really good way to think about it. So instead of saying, how can we get more people to show up in July or June or March, right? When people aren't really thinking about politics, it's, well, even if they aren't showing up, even if we're not getting more people to show up in a primary, come November, what the choices that they have in front of them look more diverse than.
And the race won't be over already, right? Like in an uncompetitive district, if it's just 1R and 1D, that race is over. But if there's 2Rs or 2Ds or, an assortment of 4 candidates, then that race still matters. And that's what will give people a meaningful vote. And that's important because we didn't, create this democracy and generations fight for it just so that you can cast a ballot that will have no impact. For our right to vote to actually mean something, it's not just the ability to cast your ballot, it's the ability to cast a ballot in a competitive election when your voice matters. And that's the type of change that I think voters are now in more numbers than ever before standing up to demand from the system.
Nick Triano, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate this conversation.
Likewise, Amy. And thanks to the Cook Political Report for all the great data, because that's how we use it to determine our primary problem every year. So great to be with you and enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll keep doing that and we'll be in touch.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much for listening to The Odd Years. If you liked what you heard or you want to make a suggestion, leave us a review or recommend us to a friend. You are the best way to get the word out about what we do. And if you want more from the Cook Political Report, consider becoming a subscriber. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report and is produced by Becca Kaufman. Thank you and talk soon.